Hi, Boosh here, just with a quick guide for playing Final Fantasy XIV with the controller. Today we're going to cover the options available to you if you choose to play controller, and then I'll do a quick run through of how I have things set up and why. A lot of people might wonder how viable it is to play an MMORPG with a controller, but the good news is that 14 has great compatibility, so you can choose to play on a controller with little to no downsides. I'm a PC player who chooses to play with a PS4 controller because I have RSI issues when using mouse and keyboard, and I've been able to beat high difficulty content including ultimates and such without any issue. The slight caveat to that is the only job I would say that has a meaningful disadvantage with controller is Astrologian, and that is due to the large amount of targeting you have to do of your own party with their card system, and you have to do a lot of that in burst. Even then, casually, not even slightly a problem, and you could reasonably comfortably do most hard content, you just might not get the cards like absolutely perfect. To start off, let's go through some of the settings that we can tweak. First up, we have standard versus legacy movement. For controller, I would heavily encourage legacy since it will play like a conventional action game. Standard kind of assumes that you have a mouse for constant quick turning of the camera for the character movement. We also have some typical settings such as inverting the X or Y axis for camera controls as well as camera speed. Tweak them at your own pleasure. Next, we have some targeting settings. Your basic targeting options on controller are tab targeting by holding down a trigger and cycling through with bumper buttons. Alternatively, you can use the D-pad, left and right for soft targeting enemies and up and down for doing the same to party members. Soft targeting will return you to the previous target after you use an action on the soft target. You can change a soft target into a hard target by pressing the confirm button. Auto targeting is also a very nice setting to have enabled and was something that was added in Endwalker. It's particularly useful in dungeons because if an enemy that you're targeting dies, then it will just go to the next enemy. It avoids clunky constant tab targeting to another enemy. One thing you will want to be mindful of though with auto targeting is that it can cause targeting of undesired enemies if you're just mindlessly pressing an attack button when your target dies. This is particularly relevant on physical range jobs. This for dungeons isn't usually important, but it can be quite important for side content such as deep dungeons or field operations where there are scary monsters that you do not want to pull because they will like slap you and one-shot you. Enabling full auto target soft targets any enemy that attacks you. Target type is for tab targeting. The first target selected is the closest to you, but the type determines what happens when cycling through the targets after that. Ignore depth considers targets on your entire screen, whereas cone targeting restricts valid targets to a cone in the direction that your camera is facing. Play about with them and pick whatever feels most intuitive. As for auto targeting priority, line of sight prioritizes based on the direction your character, not your camera, is facing, whereas closest is purely proximity. Do note that if you have cone targeting selected, it seemingly tries to account for both at the same time. The exact logic and priority isn't clear. It's a little bit ambiguous, so just experiment to see what feels right. Next up, we have ground targeting. The game's tooltips suggest holding the right bumper and using the left analog stick to aim a little dot to place a ground targeted ability. This is bad for two reasons. Firstly, positioning with this is awkward and slow, and then the other big reason is you aren't able to move your character whilst aiming, which if you're trying to place something in combat is not ideal because you might need to dodge something at the same time. Instead, I would recommend placing this ground targeting dot somewhere comfortable on your screen. Since the position of this dot is saved for the next time you use a ground targeted ability, you can remember this spot and then simply use your camera to aim. I would also recommend enabling the limit ring movement to targeting range. This will mean that even if you aim the ability past its maximum range, rather than getting an error message and the ability not going off, it will instead aim it at its max range in the direction where you are aiming. This tends to make quick distant placement far less clunky. I would also recommend the usage of targeting macros. Taking Ninja's teleport ability, Shikuchi, as an example, a macro with GT off, which stands for ground targeting off, skips the confirmation step and just teleports you to where the ground ring would be. There are also targeting macros that aim the ability towards your current target. On top of this, there are macros that target yourself or a specific member on your party list, which all can be useful in different ways for targeting generally. Gamepad mode makes some minor alterations to some menus to make them more controller friendly. You can also change the default order of the party list, which can make it easier to target certain party members with the directional pad. For instance, healers will often want to target tanks, so having them at the top makes them very quickly targetable. You can also adjust the ordering within roles, which can be useful if you want to have a targeted buff that prefers certain jobs over others. Next, let's look at hotbar settings. The primary hotbar for controllers is called the cross hotbar. A particular hotbar is selected using the controller triggers, and then an action is assigned to each face and D-pad button. You can cycle between preset hotbars with the right bumper, or you can manually select a specific hotbar by holding the right bumper and then pressing a face or D-pad button. Most of the hotbar display settings are relevant to non-controller hotbars. However, recast timer position applies to controller hotbars too. Centered recast timer shows an ability's cooldown by a big number in the middle of the icon. Bottom left is a small number in the corner. One usage for non-controller hotbars for controller players is to show the icons for cooldowns on key abilities. You can set it up in a separate hotbar above the controller hotbar. Shared hotbars are hotbars that are shared between jobs. You will probably want 4 or so hotbars that are not shared for combat, so that you could assign the combat abilities for the specific job that you're playing in those slots. The shared hotbar slots can be used for things like commonly used emotes, mounts, or macros that change gear sets. You can do some quite interesting and intricate things with macros on the shared hotbars, but that is well outside the scope of this video. For the general cross hotbar settings, you can have the cross hotbar hidden until this specific hotbar is selected. I personally like to have it permanently visible to be able to track cooldowns. Hotbar help and control guide display the name of actions and button icons when a hotbar is activated. A pet hotbar is a unique hotbar with specific relevant abilities for a pet summon. If the use pet hotbar option is selected, then pressing the right bumper to cycle through hotbars will alternate between the pet hotbar and the last non-pet hotbar. I have this deselected because it interferes with how I have my hotbar set up. You can also have pet hotbars activate only for mounts and fashion accessories. Since these are necessarily out of combat, you can't go on a mount if you're in combat, I have them enabled. You'll want to enable duty action input. Duty actions are special actions that are available in certain fights or side content. They are activated by holding a hotbar and then pressing in the right analog stick. There are 3 options for cross hotbar controls. Hold activates a hotbar by holding down one or both of the triggers. Toggle presses a trigger to activate a hotbar and then presses again to deactivate it. And Mixed allows you to either hold or press to activate. If you have dexterity issues, that might make holding a trigger for long periods difficult. Then both Toggle and Mixed have a pretty strong accessibility case. It would seem to me that Mixed is still the better option of the two, since it gives you access to an additional hotbar, but also can just be treated like Toggle. But I'm not going to pretend that I have any personal experience with either of these settings. In terms of optimal play, however, Hold is by far the best option. It is the most responsive and gives the easiest access to the greatest number of hotbars. You get access to hold left trigger, hold right trigger, hold both triggers, and the double cross hotbar, which is double tapping a trigger. The double cross hotbar is the additional cross hotbar on top of my main hotbar. I have it set to always display so that I can keep track of certain cooldowns, and I also have it set to return to the normal hotbar after an action is used. The input timer settings adjust how close the 2 taps need to be to each other to activate the double cross hotbar. Setting it to low can make it so that you can have issues pressing the trigger quickly enough, whereas setting it to high, you might accidentally activate it when you didn't intend to. Play about with this setting to find what feels smooth for you. Expanded hold controls give you access to additional hotbars by holding both triggers. You can have different hotbars for holding left trigger into holding right trigger, or for holding right trigger into holding left trigger. To utilize this effectively, you need to remember which order gives which hotbar, and to be able to effectively press them in that order in combat. An alternative approach, which is the one that I use, is to have it so that these hotbars are the same. This way you can just hold both triggers to access an additional hotbar. You can achieve this either by assigning each option the same hotbar, or as I do, setting up the hotbars to have the same abilities. You lose out on a hotbar slot here, but it simplifies the inputs massively. For instance, if you have it set up so that the order matters, then you can find yourself in an awkward spot where you are holding, say, the left trigger, and you need to hold right trigger into left trigger to access an ability. This would mean that you would need to let go of the left trigger, hold the right trigger but not too quickly to avoid getting the left into right configuration, and then after this, holding the left trigger again. In comparison, the setup that I have, where you just hold both, you simply are already holding left and then you just hold right. The next option allows you to enable and assign the hotbars for the double cross hotbar that's accessed through double tapping left trigger or right trigger. And lastly, the set selection allows you to choose which hotbars will be cycled through when tapping the right bumper. I personally have 2 hotbars selected so I can alternate between them with the tap of the button. I'll explain why later. For the last set of options, let's go into the system configuration. Here, most of the options are pretty self-explanatory. You have the option of choosing the device, the type of gamepad, whether to turn on vibration and so on. Window zoom on the right click of the analog stick allows you to cycle through menu sizes. Stick sensitivity is a little misleading. This actually refers to the assigned dead zone, and the lower the number, the smaller the dead zone, which can actually make it feel more responsive the lower it is. If your analog sticks have a little bit of drift, or if you push them slightly off center when you're in a resting position, then having some dead zone is actually beneficial. Button configuration is fairly self-explanatory. The only thing to note here is that you don't have complete freedom. For instance, shoulder button actions can only be assigned to other shoulder buttons. Where there is some interesting customization is in the clicking of the analog sticks. In particular, I would like to draw your attention to 2 options. The first is assist target. This targets your current target's target. So, for instance, if you are targeting an enemy, this would switch your focus to the party member that enemy is attacking. Pressing it again would then switch you to the enemy that your party member is hitting. This can be a nice option for healers to quickly target the tank, throw a heal on them, and then go back to the enemy. The second is the execute macro number 98 and number 99 options. These allow you to put a macro that is in either your 98th or 99th shared slot and then activate it by pressing in the stick. A popular choice for this is the sprint action, since this is a fairly common control scheme for many action games. With the options available to you covered, I would now like to discuss how I have my hotbar set up and the reason behind that particular setup. The first idea I want to discuss is that not all slots are created equally. It is, for instance, much easier to press face buttons whilst moving with the analog stick than it is to press the D-pad because your left thumb is occupied. So we want to put many of our most used actions, such as our combo GCDs, on face buttons. The front hotbars that are accessed by holding down a single trigger are more valuable than those accessed by holding down both triggers, since holding down both triggers strains both of your fingers when you use it that way, and also that hotbar is hidden until it is held, and therefore information such as cooldown timers are withheld. Therefore, we want to put most of our commonly pressed buttons and those cooldowns that we care about and carefully want to track and maybe want to use with specific timing on the front hotbars. The cross hotbar that's accessed by double tapping a trigger is not one we want to use frequently. There is an inherent slowness in accessing them since they require 2 inputs and there needs to be a slight delay between the inputs before you can access the hotbar. This can be cumbersome and can make clean weaving of abilities kind of tricky. So we want to put infrequently used abilities such as knockback immunities and limit breaks in these slots. The second idea I want to highlight is that cycling between hotbars also has an inherent delay whilst the hotbar is switching, which can make weaving kind of awkward at times. So whilst either manually cycling between hotbars by holding down the right bumper and then pressing a button, or cycling through a set number by tapping the right bumper, this might give access to multiple hotbars, but the delay in switching makes this somewhat undesirable. If there is going to be cycling, we want it to be as infrequent as possible or to not impact during combat. The last idea is that it is fairly rare to use AoE actions and single target actions in quick succession. So for dungeon mobs, you are almost exclusively using AoE rotations, whereas for bosses, you are almost exclusively using single target rotations. Accordingly, a good pair of hotbars to cycle between is a single target one and an AoE one, and this effectively frees up from our main hotbars one of those sets. So we don't need to put the AoE abilities on our single hotbar set, and we don't need to put the single target abilities on our AoE set. With all of this, we can see the reasoning for how I have my hotbars set up. The front hotbars have the most frequently pressed actions on their face buttons. I tend to find pressing square into triangle into circle feels most natural for combos for me. So this is the setup on the right trigger. And then on the left trigger, we have our burst actions, or on different different jobs additional chains of a combo on the left trigger face buttons. And then commonly used OGCDs are on the front D-pad buttons. We can see this setup is mirrored in both single target and AoE hotbars. Shared actions that are either less commonly used or less vital, such as gap closers or the action sprint, are used on the hotbar where both triggers are held. Finally, rarely used actions such as knockback immunity or tomahawk, which is a weak ranged attack, are placed on the double cross hotbar. Leftover spots on its double cross hotbar are then filled with actions from both held hotbars that, because they're hidden, I want to see their cooldowns, so they're put here, or where there's an action that I want an alternative macro variant, maybe for like slightly different targeting. Importantly, this logic is applied across jobs and roles too. If we look at Paladin quickly, we can see it has a very similar setup to Warrior. Equivalent mitigations such as its 30% and its short defensive cooldowns are in the same spaces, and it's the same story with the combos. This even extends to DPS jobs. Ninja has its 1-2-3 combo on the same buttons, and it has its ninjutsu buttons, which are used in bursts, on an equivalent place on the left trigger. All the most important OGCDs are on the front D-pad slots as well. I could go on giving examples for different jobs, but hopefully I've made my point. The purpose of this is it reduces friction when switching between jobs and also avoids conflicting muscle memories when playing different jobs. Your bread and butter combo actions, they always start on the same buttons and they always have the same sort of progression. Your tank mitigations, laid out in the same way. Is it time to do your burst? Well, hold down the left trigger and let loose. Though the specifics of what buttons you find most comfortable to press might vary from my preferences, by setting up hotbars with a similar sort of reasoning, you give yourself smooth and easy access to your most frequently used actions, and where there is any sort of slight clunkiness, it is either cordoned off to infrequently used buttons on the double cross hotbar, or it's in cycling hotbars from AoE to single target, which is often done out of combat anyways. This approach is universal and it can be applied to tanks, DPS and healers alike, and because it prevents this weird conflict of muscle memory, it makes it far easier to switch between jobs. Hopefully this guide has been useful to any of you controller players out there. Particularly I know there's going to be some new Xbox players. I hope that you experiment with the various settings and find what suits you best. And I also hope that by laying out the reasoning behind my hotbar setup, some of you will also be able to figure out what configuration is going to work best for you. With that said, thanks for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe if you want to catch more guides. If you think there's anything I missed or you know some cool tips for controller players, then leave a comment down below. And until next time, see you around.